Tom Paine was born in Thetford. He was the son of a corset maker, which would have been a very skilled job. He then became a tax inspector or collector down in Lewes, put in a claim for decent, a wage claim. Shall I say that again? He then went to Lewes and became a tax inspector and put in a wage claim on behalf of his fellow members. Then he went to America, supported the colonists in their revolt against George III, and inspired them at a time when things were quite difficult. Then he went to France, and he was elected an honorary member of the French Convention, so that he had a part in 2 revolutions. He was then imprisoned in France because he was opposed to the execution of the king, and appealed many times to the American president to rescue him, and didn't get a lot of help for a while. Then he went back to America, and the tragedy at the end of his life was that he died a forgotten man because he was against slavery, which was of course part of the American position and tradition, and he was a humanist or atheist, and therefore he alienated a large body of opinion. His books still are not allowed to be read by the prisoners in the Maze prison still, because what he says has got such power. And to be controversial 200 years after you're dead is really something. And he is alive, and the Tom Paine Society here and in America keeps that memory alive. But the British establishment, the ruling group in Britain, do not like Tom Paine and do not want to honor him. And that is the greatest tribute to the strength of his message, really, because so much of what he said then is still exciting to people today, and that excitement is not what is required, where they want a quiescent, subservient nation who will do what they're told, and Paine disturbs that. He's an agitator, and of course you know an agitator was an adjutant in Cromwell's army, so the word agitator, like all really good words, has been corrupted and misused by those who want to repress what it was all about.
He wrote The Rights of Man in England. Talk about the idea of human rights.
Edmund Burke, who was a bit of a hero in America because at one stage he supported the American colonists, was my predecessor as Member of Parliament for Bristol. He was an Irishman. He was in the tradition of the old, what were called rotten boroughs, where patrons gave you a district or constituency to represent. But he wrote quite a lot, and then in one book he described the electorate, the people, the voters, as the swinish multitude. And this phrase, the swinish multitude, the contempt of an elected man for the common people, excited Paine to write The Rights of Man. Now, the idea of inherent rights is a very old idea, really. It goes back, if you like, to the book of Genesis, when Cain killed Abel, and the Lord had a word with him about it. Cain said, "Am I my brother's keeper?" And that question, am I my brother's keeper, lies at the root of all the human rights movements in countries that are brought up in the Judeo-Christian tradition. Am I my brother's keeper? An injury to one is an injury to all. United we stand, divided we fall. You do not cross a picket line. That's the root of it. And if we're all children of God, and under the fatherhood of God, then of course we're brothers and sisters. And if you're brothers and sisters, you expect to be treated properly. Now, the bishops had a very clever way of dealing with this. The bishops would say to you, well, I know it's a very unjust world, but if the rich are kind and the poor are patient, it'll all be all right when we're dead. And some people said, well, why do we have to wait till we're dead? And so then the idea of human rights excited people, and it goes right back in English.
Let's bring it back to Paine, though, in the sense of...
Well, I'm tracing it through, you see. And the idea of human rights, the Spartacist rebellion in Rome, the Peasants' Revolt in England, the English Revolution, and Paine. So Paine, in talking about the rights of man, and that's a sexist phrase, the rights of men and women, was actually in a very ancient tradition, but he reinvigorated it. And of course it was following the French Revolution when these ideas were becoming alive anyway. And the rights of man, the inherent rights of mankind, of humanity, are still controversial because all over the world people are repressed. So Paine speaks for humanity in 1992 as he did in 1791.
Why were they so afraid of him? And we can't say what they did to him, and why so terrified of these ideas, they sound?
Well, the reason why the idea of the rights of man is threatening is because we live in a very unjust society. And when you challenge the power of the rich on behalf of the disinherited, you are threatening the whole structure of society. I mean, Jesus was crucified, and everyone who's ever argued that men and women have equal rights has always been hated by the people with power. They may have got their power by conquest, they may have got it by inheritance, they may have got it wealth, they may have got it by graft, by corruption, but they don't want anyone to challenge the right of that power. I've learned in my life 5 little democratic questions which I put to people with powerful. It might be Robert Maxwell, you know, that corrupt English publisher, might be Mr. Brezhnev, might be Jacques Delors. If you meet a powerful person, ask them 5 questions. What power have you got? Where did you get it from? In whose interest do you exercise it? To whom are you accountable? And how can we get rid of you? Now, that last question, how can we get rid of you, is the democratic question. And Paine asked it of kings and emperors and rulers, and of course they didn't like it. I've always thought democracy was the really controversial thing. I mean, you can preach socialism and nobody cares, so long as nothing happens, like a bishop can give a sermon about human brotherhood, and as long as nothing happens till next Sunday. But when you challenge power, then they turn on you, and they crucify you, and they destroy you, and they harass you. And Paine was a victim of that, and that's why he's so important today, when power is so widely abused in capitalist and communist and many other dictatorial societies.
He wrote in a language that ordinary people could understand.
That's right.
You could go into that, and the idea of people participation.
Well, he believed, you see, genuinely in the talent and genius of human beings. And for him, he said the mind was his church. And I forget all the quotations, you'll have them and no doubt be quoting them. But can I take the one on war, which I like very much? I've been quoting this in many meetings. This is Paine again in 1791. It could have been written for the Gulf War or the Vietnam War or the Suez War or the Falklands War or whatever. As war is the system of government on the old construction, the animosity which nations reciprocally entertain is nothing more than what the policy of their government excites to keep up the spirit of the system, the Cold War. Each government accuses the other of perfidy, intrigue and ambition as a means of heating the imagination of their respective nations and incensing them to hostilities. Man is not the enemy of man, but through the medium of a false system of government. What inducement has the farmer, while following the plough, to lay aside his peaceful pursuit and go to war with the farmer of another country? Are not conquest and defeat each of the same price, and taxes the never-failing consequence? As the barbarism of the present old governments expire, the moral condition of nations with respect to each other will be changed. Man will not be brought up with the savage idea of considering his species as his enemy because the accident of birth gave the individual's existence in countries distinguished by different names. Now that really is the moral argument for world government. It's the Rio argument, the Rio summit. It's everything. And to have said it at the time was unbelievably far ahead of his time. To say it today would also identify him as a target for the CIA and the KGB and MI5 and SAVAK and BOSS. Every intelligence company, organization in the world would go for a man who said things like that, because it undermines their power and the power of the media to excite the imagination to hostility. And after all, America is the richest country in the world and the biggest debtor country in the world. It's bankrupted itself with its weapons. President Bush had to go to Japan on his knees with 100,000 nuclear missiles in his hip pocket to plead with the Japanese to buy a few gas guzzlers from Detroit. And the American army is a mercenary army in the Gulf War. They couldn't send the troops there unless the King of Saudi Arabia paid it. The Russians were bankrupted by their weapons. They spent 70% of their gross domestic product on weapons, bankrupted them. When history comes to be written, that will be the reason why the Russian system collapsed. So Paine was talking about a lot of things that have an immediate resonance in the world in which we live.
he also talked about welfare, and maybe you can
yes.
put it back in those times. What an unusual idea that was. Talk about we should help the old and the poor.
He was the founder of what's called the welfare state, which I suppose found its expression in Roosevelt's New Deal during the Depression in the 1930s, and in the welfare state of the Labour government of 1945. Expressed itself in some of the reforms that were introduced in Germany in the 19th century under Bismarck. The idea that you had, capitalism providing the wealth and then a distribution of it to those who were poor. And the welfare state is now being dismantled in America, being dismantled in Britain, because we're back in a slump of 1930s proportions. So here again, in arguing that human rights wasn't just a matter of legal right, but a right to have a full life, was not only 200 years ahead of its time, but is still controversial, as that whole structure of social welfare is dismantled in the interest of preserving a system based upon profit and not upon people.
I'm interested. Then he made democracy, he made people understand that government wasn't a great mysterious thing that has to be kept secret, and that's relevant today.
Well, you see, there are two ways, or three ways, in which the governors can control the governed, or approach the governed. One is by mystifying everything. If you knew what we knew, you wouldn't ask such a silly question. And that mystification is very popular today. We're a highly technical society. If you haven't got a PhD in economics, you can't ask why you're unemployed. The second way is oversimplifying it. That's the demagogue. It's all due to the foreigners or the blacks, or we're being kicked about by people all over the world, the Libyans or whoever it is. But the real way to do it is to clarify. And what Tom Paine did was to clarify the issues. He explained them. He was a teacher. He wasn't just an academic teacher who said it and did nothing about it. He was a teacher who also expressed solidarity with the American revolutionaries and the French revolutionaries and the British working class and the Irish and so on. So he clarified, and by clarifying, he illuminated and gave people confidence in themselves. And that's what's so frightening about him, because any government wants people to be subservient, to take what they hear on CNN or the BBC or Radio Moscow, and to clarify the choices so people feel that they understand what the real essence of the choice is, and then take it for themselves. That's what makes him frightening. The marvelous quotation from Lao Tzu, which I like very much, as to the best leaders, the people do not notice their existence. The next best the people honor and praise, the next best the people hate, the next best the people fear. But when the best leader's work is done, said Lao Tzu, the people say, we did it ourselves. Now, in the case of Tom Paine, he gave people the strength to do it themselves, and that was a threat. Then it is a threat now, and I suspect it will always be a threat to those in power.
Why is it that people, both the left and right, like Tom Paine? Because we've talked to a lot of right-wing fanatics who sort of latch on his idea that the less government is better, and those ideas. Really, as a free enterprise man, too, it's curious.
Well, he was a libertarian. And if you look at the circle of political argument, you do meet some people coming round the other way. There is an authoritarianism of left and right, which is in coalition with one another. I always thought, visiting Washington and Moscow over the last 40 years, how similar they were. They both had in the one case, the commissars, in the other case, the people in Wall Street. And they were both, one was a commissar of capitalism, one was a commissar of communism. They both had their information systems to keep people subservient. They both whipped people up to hate the other. And Paine was a challenge to both. He would have been imprisoned by Stalin and imprisoned by Reagan. And being a libertarian, he did appeal to people who saw government as a threat, though, of course, in arguing for welfare, he was arguing that the community, through its government, through its elected government, had a responsibility to do something. And then you have to decide whether the welfare system is liberational in character, whether it gives people rights they didn't have to a decent income, or whether it becomes a method of social control. because welfare can become a method of social control. And Paine would have appealed to those who suspected government, as well as being an advocate of a government that took responsibility for the welfare of its fellow citizens. Absolutely riveting that he should have such an appeal, and yet I would not regard him as a Reaganite or a Thatcherite at all.
Although they quote him.
They quote him, but then they don't really understand him. I mean, people get the Bible is quoted by all sorts of hideous people, isn't it?
Has he been given his due in the British history books?
Oh no, Tom Paine is totally ignored. Indeed, he's still seen as a threat. And it is an extraordinary thing that children can come through the school system or even go on to college and never be told about Tom Paine. I mean, for my own part, I had an expensive education and I had to discover about the Peasants' Revolt and the Levellers and the Diggers and the English Revolution and Tom Paine for myself. Even had to discover about Karl Marx. I had an education at the University of Oxford, which was supposed to be very good, and all I remember anyone saying to me when I studied modern politics was that Marx was wrong. I don't remember anyone saying anything else about him. So everybody has to discover it for themselves. And he appeals to dissenters and dissidents, and there are just as many of them in the Western world as ever there were in Stalin's Russia.
This quote from the BBC in 1982, among decent Englishmen of his time, his name is synonymous with treachery and blasphemy.
Well, yes, that shows the threat he still represents, doesn't it? You see, the interesting thing about the church and Paine is that there is a part of Christian teaching which is purely Painite, the idea of brotherhood. But the bishops wanted to control it all. And what people don't realize, for example, it was illegal to read the Bible in England until 400 years ago. It was chained in the churches, so people couldn't read it. So the bishops thought that they had a hotline to the Almighty, just as the media now think they have a hotline to wisdom. And you're only fed what the media want you to know. And to discover it for yourself, to think for yourself, is as big a threat to the modern media, because the BBC is the modern version of the church. I mean, Henry VIII nationalised the Church of England because he wanted a priest in every pulpit in every parish every Sunday telling you God wanted you to do what the King wanted you to do. And the BBC now has a pundit on every channel every night telling you there's no alternative to what the government wants you to do. So there is an extraordinary parallel between all these conflicts, and to understand Paine you have to see him backwards as well as forwards. He speaks for a tradition of which we are heirs and which I feel to be my own tradition, just as powerful as the tradition of hierarchy, monarchy, discipline, law and order, subservience, privilege, patronage, and all the corrupt things that characterize the British system of government.
Tell us about you're trying to get a stamp to the American Revolution, and how the American Revolution is always still a threat here.
Yes, I was some years ago Postmaster General, and I asked for a stamp to be put out for Tom Paine. And I had a marvellous letter back, I think I probably got the text of it here, from the post office, saying, although the bicentenary, we call it that, not bicentennial, of the Declaration of Independence by the American colonies has support from the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, it is, in our view, a subject not suitable for inclusion in our special stamp program. However it might be approached in design terms, there would be a danger that ordinary people would criticize the issue as celebrating a defeat. This was 1976. Moreover, there could well be a feeling in those former British colonies which did achieve their independence later, but without bloodshed, that whilst, for instance, we did not mark the centenary of the British North America Act of 1867, that was the Canadian Act, we should seem to honour those who've rebelled. Now that did really make me laugh, because it showed that deep in the recesses of the post office and every government department was just a little note: the American colonies had rebelled, why should we join with them? And when we discussed in the cabinet, of which I was a member then, how we should celebrate the bicentennial, I said, why don't we pass an act giving the American colonies their freedom, which we'd never done. And somebody said, I'm not sure it would get through the House of Commons. So it was just a reminder of the way in which these old controversies live. And Paine, of course, is a classic case of for articulating them.
Well, Paine put the American...
This is Wild Track for Tony Benn interview in Holland Park.